In the summer of 1848, in Williamson County, Tennessee, something happened that shattered every assumption a plantation owner had about control, identity, and the boundaries of his own household. A man named Robert Hutchins, who thought he'd purchased a young woman for domestic service. A wife who developed an unexpected attachment. And a truth that, when finally revealed, destroyed a family's reputation and exposed how little slaveholders actually knew about the people they claimed to own. If stories about deception and hidden identity matter to you, about how enslaved people could manipulate the very systems meant to control them, then stay with me. Because what happened at Hutchins' estate between 1846 and 1848 tells you everything you need to know about passing, about the assumptions that blinded slaveholders, and about how the rigid categories of race and gender could be subverted by someone desperate and clever enough. The year 1846 sits in a period when Tennessee slavery was profitable but increasingly controversial. The state was divided. Western Tennessee resembled Deep South plantation culture, while Eastern Tennessee had significant anti-slavery sentiment. Williamson County, just south of Nashville, was firmly in the plantation camp, with large estates producing tobacco and cotton. Robert Hutchins was 38 years old in 1846, owner of Hutchins Estate, 1,800 acres, 45 enslaved people, profitable tobacco production. He'd inherited the plantation from his father in 1840 and had proven himself a capable manager. He was married to Carolyn Hutchins, who was 32 years old, and they had 2 sons, ages 8 and 10. The marriage was stable by the standards of the time. Robert managed plantation business. Caroline managed the household. They maintained their social position, attended church regularly, were respected members of Williamson County society. In July 1846, Robert traveled to Nashville to purchase additional enslaved workers at auction. The estate needed more domestic help. Caroline had been complaining that managing the household with only 3 house servants was becoming difficult as their social obligations increased. At the auction, Robert noticed a young person being sold as Sarah, described as 18 years old, light-skinned, trained in household service, literate. The seller explained that Sarah had been owned by an estate that was being liquidated after the owner's death. Sarah was small, delicate, with refined features and a quiet demeanor. Robert examined the paperwork. Everything appeared legitimate. The price was reasonable for a trained domestic servant. Robert purchased Sarah for $750 and brought her back to Hutchins' estate in late July 1846. What Robert didn't know, what he never thought to question, was that Sarah was not a woman. Sarah was actually a man named Samuel, who'd been passing as female for 3 years to escape the brutal conditions of field labor and gain access to the relatively easier work of domestic service. Samuel had been born in 1828 on a Virginia plantation. By the time he was 15, he understood that his small build and refined features would condemn him to either brutal field labor that would likely kill him young, or to sexual exploitation by masters or overseers. Neither option was acceptable. So Samuel made a desperate decision. He would live as a woman. If he could convince slaveholders he was female, he'd be assigned to domestic work rather than fields, would avoid the specific dangers that threatened enslaved men, might have better opportunities to eventually escape. The deception required careful planning. Samuel learned women's mannerisms from watching enslaved women around him. He practiced speaking in a higher register. He learned to sew, cook, perform domestic tasks that were gender-coded as female. And he bound his chest and used clothing strategically to create the appearance of female proportions. When the Virginia estate was liquidated, Samuel, now calling himself Sarah, was sold south. He maintained the deception through multiple sales, always presenting as a young woman trained in household service. Each new owner accepted the paperwork and appearance at face value, never questioning whether Sarah was what she claimed to be. By the time Robert Hutchins purchased Sarah in 1846, Samuel had been living as a woman for 3 years and had perfected the performance. Sarah arrived at Hutchins' estate and was introduced to Caroline and the household staff. Caroline was pleased. Sarah seemed well-trained, quiet, capable. She assigned Sarah to assist with household tasks, cleaning, serving meals, helping with laundry, attending Caroline during her daily routines. For the first few months, everything proceeded normally. Sarah performed her duties competently, spoke little, kept to herself. The other enslaved people at Hutchins' estate accepted Sarah as a woman without question. But Caroline began to notice something unusual. She felt an unexpected connection to Sarah. They'd spend time together as Caroline went about her daily routines, and Caroline found herself talking to Sarah in ways she didn't with other enslaved people, sharing thoughts, discussing books, having conversations that felt almost like friendship. This wasn't entirely unusual. Plantation mistresses sometimes developed close relationships with enslaved domestic workers, though these relationships always occurred within the framework of ownership and were fundamentally unequal. But Caroline's attachment to Sarah seemed more intense than normal. By early 1847, Caroline was spending most of her time with Sarah. She'd request Sarah's presence during morning routines, during afternoon sewing, during evening reading. She gave Sarah access to the library, would discuss books they'd both read, seemed to genuinely enjoy Sarah's company. Robert noticed but wasn't particularly concerned. He was pleased that Caroline had found a capable domestic servant she liked. It kept Caroline content and freed him to focus on plantation management. What Robert didn't notice, what Caroline herself barely understood initially, was that her feelings for Sarah were developing beyond companionship into something more complicated. Caroline was 33 years old, married for 15 years, mother of 2 children. Her marriage to Robert was stable, but passionless. Robert was often away managing plantation business or socializing with other planters. Caroline spent most of her time alone or with enslaved domestic workers, managing a household that ran itself, performing social duties that felt hollow. Sarah, educated, articulate, attentive, provided intellectual and emotional engagement that Caroline hadn't experienced in years. Caroline found herself looking forward to time with Sarah, feeling disappointed when Sarah was occupied with other tasks, thinking about Sarah during the hours they were apart. By mid-1847, Caroline recognized that what she felt for Sarah wasn't just appreciation for a good servant. It was attraction, romantic and physical attraction to another woman, or rather, to someone she believed was a woman. For Caroline, this realization was deeply disturbing. She'd been raised in a society that considered same-sex desire unnatural and sinful. She was a respectable married woman, a mother, a churchgoer. Having these feelings for an enslaved woman added another layer of impossibility, crossing both gender boundaries and racial boundaries simultaneously. Caroline tried to suppress her feelings, to maintain proper distance from Sarah, but the attraction only intensified. She began finding excuses to touch Sarah, adjusting her hair, helping her with tasks, casual contact that felt charged with meaning. Samuel, living as Sarah, recognized what was happening. He understood that Caroline was developing romantic and sexual feelings for him. This created a profound dilemma. On one hand, Carolyn's attachment provided safety. An enslaved person who was valued and desired by the mistress was less likely to face harsh punishment, more likely to receive privileges, better positioned to eventually gain freedom. On the other hand, if the relationship became physical and Samuel's biological sex was discovered, the consequences would be catastrophic. He could be killed. At minimum, he'd face brutal punishment and likely be sold to the worst conditions available. Samuel decided to carefully manage the situation, accept Caroline's emotional attachment and some physical intimacy, but prevent anything that would reveal his anatomy. It required constant vigilance and strategic boundary setting, but it was possible. By late 1847, Carolyn and Sarah's relationship had become physically intimate, though within limits that Samuel carefully maintained. They would embrace, would kiss, would share a bed occasionally when Robert was away. But Samuel always ensured that clothing remained partially on, that certain boundaries weren't crossed, that nothing happened that would reveal the truth. For Caroline, the relationship was both fulfilling and agonizing. She was experiencing romantic and sexual satisfaction she'd never had with Robert. But she was also consumed by guilt and fear of discovery. If anyone learned about her relationship with Sarah, a same-sex relationship and an interracial relationship, she'd be socially destroyed, possibly prosecuted, definitely ostracized from everything she knew. The other enslaved people at Hutchins Estate began to notice that something unusual was happening between Caroline and Sarah. They saw how much time the mistress spent with Sarah, noticed the way Caroline looked at Sarah, recognized the intimacy between them. An enslaved woman named Ruth, who'd been at Hutchins Estate for 20 years, tried to warn Sarah. "You be careful with Mistress Caroline. She's getting too attached to you. That kind of attention from a white woman, it ain't safe. Something goes wrong, you'll be the one who suffers." Samuel, as Sarah, acknowledged the risk, but felt trapped. What am I supposed to do? Refuse her? That'll make things worse. I just have to manage it carefully. Just watch yourself. White folks' feelings are dangerous for us, especially when those feelings ain't supposed to exist. The situation reached a crisis point in March 1848. Caroline realized she was pregnant. This should have been straightforward. She was married, pregnancy was expected. But Caroline knew with certainty that Robert wasn't the father. She and Robert had barely been intimate in the past year, and the timing didn't match. The impossible truth was that somehow, despite all logic and biological understanding, Carolyn believed Sarah had gotten her pregnant. Of course, this was impossible. Two people with female biology cannot reproduce together. But Carolyn didn't know that Sarah was biologically male. She only knew that she'd been intimate with Sarah, and now she was pregnant. Carolyn was terrified and confused. She couldn't understand how this was possible, but she knew the pregnancy timing corresponded with her intimacy with Sarah. And she knew that if anyone suspected the truth, both she and Sarah would face terrible consequences. Caroline decided to present the pregnancy as Robert's. She began initiating intimacy with Robert for the first time in months, establishing a plausible timeline that would allow him to believe the child was his. Robert accepted this explanation without question. He was pleased that Caroline was finally being affectionate again, assumed the pregnancy was a natural result of their marriage, had no reason to suspect anything else. But Caroline knew the truth, or what she believed was the truth, and she needed to speak with Sarah about it. One afternoon when Robert was away, Caroline summoned Sarah to her private sitting room. "Sarah, I'm pregnant. Carolyn said without preamble. Sarah's heart dropped. This shouldn't be possible. Samuel had been so careful, had never allowed the kind of intimacy that would result in pregnancy. Unless... The terrible realization dawned on Samuel. Caroline had also been intimate with Robert at some point, probably when Samuel thought they were maintaining separate bedrooms. The pregnancy had to be Robert's, but Caroline apparently believed otherwise. "Mistress, I don't understand," Sarah said carefully. "Neither do I. But I know. The timing matches our time together. Somehow you—" Caroline couldn't finish the sentence. Even saying it out loud seemed impossible. Samuel understood he was at a critical decision point. He could maintain the deception, let Caroline believe something impossible had happened. Or he could reveal the truth and face whatever consequences came. The pregnancy meant Carolyn's secret would eventually become visible. If she truly believed Sarah had somehow gotten her pregnant, she might do something desperate when the child was born and clearly had Robert's features. The situation was spiraling beyond Samuel's control. Samuel made a decision. The truth was coming out eventually. Better to control when and how. "Mistress Caroline, I need to tell you something. But I need you to promise you'll let me explain fully before you react." "What do you mean?" "I'm not who you think I am." Over the next hour, Samuel revealed everything. His birth as male, his decision to live as female to escape field labor and exploitation, the 3 years of successfully passing as Sarah, his arrival at Hutchins' estate, and the truth about their relationship. Carolyn listened in stunned silence as her entire understanding of reality rearranged itself. The person she'd fallen in love with, the woman she'd been intimate with, was actually a man. The impossible pregnancy made sense now. It was Robert's child, and Sarah was a biological man. When Samuel finished explaining, Caroline sat motionless for several minutes. Then she began to laugh, not from humor, but from the sheer absurdity and horror of the situation. "So you're a man, this entire time. You've been a man." "Yes, mistress. And we..." Caroline couldn't finish. "Our relationship was real, Mistress Caroline. My feelings for you are real. The gender I was born with doesn't change what we meant to each other. Doesn't change. It changes everything. I don't have feelings for men besides my husband. I thought you were a woman. I thought what we had was... God, I don't even know what I thought." Caroline was cycling through emotions, betrayal, confusion, anger, lingering attraction, that now felt even more forbidden. "Are you going to tell Master Robert?" Samuel asked quietly. Caroline considered. Telling Robert would mean explaining how she'd discovered Sarah was actually Samuel, which would mean revealing their intimate relationship, which would destroy her reputation and probably get Samuel killed. "No," Caroline said finally. "I can't tell him. But you need to leave. I'll have Robert sell you, say you've been unsatisfactory, that I want you gone. You'll be sold to someone else, you'll take your secret with you, and we'll never speak of this again." "What about your pregnancy?" "The baby is Robert's. I'll raise it as Robert's child. No one will ever know the truth about any of this." Samuel was being given an unexpected opportunity to be sold away rather than killed or brutally punished. It was the best outcome he could have hoped for, given the circumstances. But before either of them could act on this plan, Robert returned home unexpectedly early. He'd been away for 3 days on business in Nashville and had come back a day sooner than planned. He went to find Carolyn and walked in on her still closeted with Sarah, both of them looking emotional and disheveled from the intense conversation. "What's going on here?" Robert asked, immediately suspicious. His wife and a slave, alone together, both visibly upset. It looked improper even without knowing the full context. Caroline froze. She couldn't explain without revealing too much. Samuel made a split-second decision. If the truth was coming out anyway, better to control the narrative. "Master Hutchins, there's something you need to know. I've been deceiving you since you purchased me. My name isn't Sarah, it's Samuel. I'm not a woman. I'm a man who's been passing as female for 3 years. Robert stared at Samuel, not comprehending. "What are you talking about?" Samuel explained the same story he'd told Caroline. His decision to live as female, the successful deception through multiple owners, his arrival at Hutchins' estate, still maintaining the disguise. As Robert processed this information, he turned to Caroline. "You knew about this?" "I just found out," Caroline said, which was technically true. "How did you find out?" Caroline couldn't answer without revealing their relationship. The silence stretched. Robert's suspicion grew. "Caroline, why were you two alone in here? Why do you both look so upset? What else happened?" The truth was going to come out. Caroline could feel it. But she made one last attempt to protect herself. Samuel, was making inappropriate advances. I rejected them, and that's when he revealed his true identity. I was about to call for you to have him removed. Samuel understood what Caroline was doing, throwing him to the wolves to protect herself. It was predictable, but still painful. Their relationship, which had felt real despite its impossible circumstances, was being erased and rewritten as assault. Robert's anger shifted from confusion to rage. An enslaved man, disguised as a woman, in a position of intimate access to his wife, making inappropriate advances. This was every slaveholder's nightmare. "You're saying this? This man disguised himself as a woman, got into our household, and then tried to take advantage of you?" Caroline nodded, hating herself, but seeing no other way to survive the situation. Robert called for his overseer and the local sheriff. Samuel was taken into custody immediately. Chained in the cellar, while authorities decided what to do. The scandal exploded across Williamson County. A man had successfully passed as a woman for 3 years, had been sold multiple times without anyone detecting the deception, had gained intimate access to a wealthy white household. Newspaper articles discussed the case with a mixture of horror and fascination. How had multiple slaveholders been so thoroughly deceived? What did this say about the competence of the system if enslaved people could manipulate it so successfully? The focus quickly shifted to questions of what Samuel had done while in the Hutchins household. Caroline maintained her story. Samuel had made inappropriate advances. She'd rejected them. Robert had discovered the truth. But the enslaved community at Hutchins' estate knew more. Ruth and others had witnessed the growing intimacy between Caroline and Sarah over the months. They didn't know Sarah was actually Samuel, but they knew the relationship had been real, consensual, and mutual. Some of this information leaked out through the informal networks enslaved people used to communicate. Whispered conversations suggested that maybe Caroline's version of events wasn't entirely accurate, that maybe the mistress had been more involved than she claimed. Robert heard these whispers and confronted Caroline again, this time more directly. "Tell me the truth. What really happened between you and him?" Caroline could have maintained her lie, but the weight of deception, the pregnancy she knew wasn't Robert's, the relationship she'd had with someone she thought was a woman, the betrayal and confusion, was too much. "I thought Sarah was a woman," Caroline said quietly. "I developed feelings. We became intimate. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know until today that Sarah was actually a man." Robert struggled to process this. His wife had been in a romantic relationship with an enslaved woman, or what everyone thought was an enslaved woman, and that enslaved woman turned out to be a man who'd been deceiving everyone. "The baby," Robert said slowly. "Is it mine?" Caroline wanted to lie, but she was exhausted from lies. "Yes, it has to be. We were together in February, remember? The timing matches. The pregnancy is yours." Robert chose to believe this because the alternative was too complicated. If the child was his, then at least that part of his life remained intact. "What do you want to do?" Robert asked. Caroline understood the question. Did she want Samuel punished severely, killed? Or would she show mercy to someone she'd cared about, even if that care had been based on false premises? "Sell him," Caroline said. "Sell him to someone far away, somewhere he can never come back. I don't want him dead, but I never want to see him again." Robert agreed to this solution. It avoided the embarrassment of a public trial, where Caroline's relationship with Sarah would be examined in detail. It removed Samuel from their lives permanently. It allowed Robert to maintain some control over an utterly humiliating situation. Samuel was sold in April 1848 to a trader heading to the Mississippi Delta. Before he left, Ruth managed to speak with him briefly. "I'm sorry," she said. "Sorry for what happened. Sorry you couldn't just be yourself." "I was myself," Samuel replied. "Maybe not the gender they thought, but everything else was real. My intelligence, my capabilities, my feelings, all of that was real. They just couldn't see it because they were so sure they knew what I was." "What will you do now?" "Same thing I've been doing. Survive. Find ways to be free, even if that freedom is just in my head. Keep moving until I find somewhere I can actually be safe." Samuel was taken away in chains. His fate after leaving Tennessee is unknown. No records trace what happened to him, whether he continued passing as female, whether he ever achieved actual freedom, whether he survived the brutal conditions of Mississippi Delta plantations. Carolyn gave birth in November 1848 to a daughter who was clearly Robert's child. The marriage survived, barely. Robert never fully trusted Caroline again, and Caroline lived with the guilt and confusion of her feelings for someone she'd thought was a woman, but who turned out to be a man. The scandal gradually faded, though the Hutchins family's reputation was permanently damaged. People whispered about the situation for years. The enslaved man who'd passed as a woman, the mistress who'd fallen for the disguise, the pregnancy, and the questions about paternity. What makes this story significant is what it reveals about identity, deception, and the limitations of slaveholders' knowledge about the people they claimed to own. Samuel successfully passed as female for 3 years, fooling multiple owners, auctioneers, and eventually an entire household. He did this to survive, to escape the specific dangers that threatened him as a young enslaved man, to find some measure of safety in a world that offered him none. The fact that he succeeded for so long shows that gender, like race, was largely performance. Samuel performed femininity well enough that no one questioned it. He understood that enslaved people were rarely examined carefully. They were property to be purchased and put to work, not individuals whose identities warranted close investigation. Caroline's attraction to Sarah reveals how desire doesn't follow the neat categories that society constructs. She developed genuine feelings for someone she believed was a woman, feelings strong enough to overcome her religious training and her understanding of her own sexuality. When she learned Sarah was actually Samuel, those feelings didn't disappear. They became more complicated, more difficult to categorize, but they remained real. The pregnancy adds another layer of complexity. It was biologically Robert's child, but Caroline initially believed it was somehow Sarah's, which was impossible given what Caroline understood about biology and reproduction. The depth of Caroline's confusion shows how thoroughly Samuel's performance had convinced her. She was willing to believe in an impossible pregnancy, rather than question Sarah's gender identity. The ending, with Samuel sold away and the family maintaining a facade of normalcy, reflects how slavery enabled white people to simply remove problems rather than deal with their complexity. Samuel had upended the Hutchins household's understanding of reality, but rather than grapple with the implications, Robert just sold him away. For Samuel, the outcome was survival. He'd been discovered but hadn't been killed. He'd caused a scandal, but would live to possibly find freedom somewhere else. In a system designed to destroy enslaved people, that counted as success. This story forces uncomfortable questions about identity, about how we understand gender and desire, about the deceptions enslaved people used to survive, and about how little slaveholders actually knew about the complex human beings they claimed to own. Remember this story. Remember that it happened in 1848, in Tennessee, involving an enslaved person who successfully passed as a different gender for years as a survival strategy. Remember that Samuel's deception worked because slaveholders made assumptions based on appearance and documentation, never questioning whether someone might be performing an identity for strategic reasons. Remember that Caroline developed real feelings for someone she thought was a woman, and those feelings didn't simply disappear when she learned the truth about Samuel's gender. Remember that the enslaved community knew more about what was really happening than the white family did, that their observations and knowledge were dismissed because enslaved people's testimony was considered worthless. This is part of slavery's history, not just the obvious cruelties, but the hidden stories of how people survived, the identities they performed, the deceptions they maintained, and the complex human relationships that developed despite the system's attempts to reduce everything to simple categories of owner and property. The case of Samuel Sarah shows that even in the most controlled environments, enslaved people found ways to manipulate the system, to create space for survival, to be more complex and strategic than their owners ever imagined. It's part of our history, complicated, challenging our assumptions about gender and identity, revealing the limitations of slaveholders' power and knowledge. Remember it, all of it. What do you think about Samuel's deception? Was passing as female a brilliant survival strategy, or a violation of Caroline's consent, since their relationship was based on false premises? Can we judge historical cases of gender passing using modern frameworks, or do we need to understand them purely within their historical context of survival under slavery? Was Caroline a victim, deceived into a relationship based on mistaken identity? Or was she complicit in a relationship that violated both racial and gender boundaries, and her claims of being deceived were just attempts to escape accountability? These questions resist simple answers. Samuel was trying to survive in a system that would have destroyed him otherwise. Caroline developed genuine feelings for someone within the constraints of what she believed was possible. Both were trapped in a system that denied full humanity to enslaved people, while also rigidly policing gender and sexuality. Leave your comment below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who appreciates historical narratives that challenge our assumptions about identity and desire. At History in Chains, we believe in presenting history honestly, acknowledging cases that complicate our understanding of gender, sexuality, and survival strategies under oppression. This story forces us to think about how enslaved people navigated impossible situations, how desire operates beyond the boundaries society constructs, and how little control anyone really had in a system built on dehumanization. See you in the next video.